I get more questions about my Leica Monochrom workflow than anything else, particularly when it comes to editing files. It seems the biggest challenge for those looking to move into black and white photography, regardless of the camera or the type of sensor, is how to end up with photos that've got a bit of life to them and aren't just flat and dull. I'm going to share my approach to this and how I work with a monochrome file, but this is relevant to those using a color censored camera too. There are two ways I approach my black and white photography in terms of how I look at and edit my files to get the results that I want. So I made two short videos. This is part 2, which deals with contrast of light and how I work and edit those types of images, and part 1 is how you work with very colorful compositions to get best results, and that's linked at the end of this video. Because the color in front of us is irrelevant with black and white photography, the thing to look for is contrast of light and shade. To me, this is photography in its purest form. It's all about light. The low light backlighting the church with all the gravestones provided some very contrasty and graphic compositions. In this situation, I'm making sure I don't blow my highlights, which means because I'm working with so much dynamic range here, the shadow areas are virtually black. The great thing about a monochrome file is the ability to bring up the shadow detail, something you can't do quite as effectively using an equivalent color sensor. I'm opening this file up in Camera Raw and do hardly anything to it other than lift the shadows a touch. Then I create a second version of the file and bring up the exposure, contrast, shadows, and add some texture and clarity. The second version of this file is all about the details in the foreground elements, which are typically the focal point of the photo. From here I create 2 layers in Photoshop. I use the original darker exposure as the top layer, make a mask and bring out a little bit of detail with the airbrush tool. Because this type of photo is all about contrast, it's up to you to push and exaggerate that contrast to your heart's desire. You're in total control. Now I've done 3 versions of this image to demonstrate that. First is a subtle version. There's less contrast here, but I like the subtlety of it. It's reminiscent of an early 20th century landscape photo. For this next version, I pushed the contrast a little bit, using the S-curve tool to help me do that. And this final version is my personal favorite. I like this high contrast look, breaking up those fine tones. And as I've said before on this channel, I like to bring out grain. With this photo, again, I've made 2 versions. The first is pretty much as I shot it, with intact highlights. I brought up the shadows and contrast a little bit. I lightened the exposure on the second version, added a little bit more contrast and clarity, and just blend them together. That's it. I wanted the angel to be the focal point here, so in addition to making her sharper and more contrasty to bring out the texture of the stone, I also shot with a shallower depth of field to create separation from the background. So that's how I edit high contrast photos. Now what about compositions, landscapes, travel shots with lots of color but not so much contrasting light? How do I work with those? Well, if you take a look at this short video, all will be revealed.